When I stepped out of the massage room that evening, my legs felt shaky, not because of the pain that had been tormenting my lower back for weeks, but because of the man who had just finished working on me. I told my husband I was trying a new therapist. That was technically true. What I didn't tell him was that the therapist was someone from my past. Someone I hadn't seen in decades. Someone who once called my mother his wife. My former stepfather. As I drove home in silence, the familiar smell of eucalyptus oil clung to my clothes. My mind replayed every movement of his hands, every pause in his breath, every time his fingers hovered just a little too long. I had gone there because of pain. Physical pain. But what I felt now was something else entirely. Something I wasn't ready to name. And if I'm being honest, something I wasn't ready to stop. 3 months ago, if you had told me I'd end up in this situation, I would have laughed. But now I'm not laughing. I'm remembering. And I need to tell you everything, before the next appointment changes my life for good. But before I do that, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, and have you ever trusted someone from your past more than you should have? The pain started in my left hip, sometime last winter. It was dull at first, like a small reminder of age or tension, the kind of thing you ignore while unloading groceries or climbing stairs. But then it spread. It turned into a persistent ache that would wake me in the middle of the night. My doctor prescribed muscle relaxants, but they left me foggy and disoriented. Physical therapy helped slightly, but only when I was consistent, which I wasn't. Between work, the house, and my husband's never-ending projects, I just didn't prioritize myself. Still, it was getting worse. I found myself wincing when bending to load the dishwasher, shifting uncomfortably during long dinners, and even avoiding intimacy altogether. My husband didn't press. He never did. That's part of the problem. We've been married 23 years. There's no tragedy there, no scandal, no affair, no violence. Just distance. Quiet, creeping distance that settled in like dust on untouched furniture. We loved each other in a way that looked respectable from the outside. We were good at routine. We were not good at passion, nor at change. One Saturday, I mentioned my back pain to our neighbor while we were trimming the hedges between our yards. She suggested someone who had helped her tremendously when her sciatica flared. Private practice. Not flashy. But he knows what he's doing, she said. I called that afternoon. A male voice answered. Calm. Confident. Familiar. When he said his name, I nearly dropped the phone. It had been over 30 years since I'd last seen him. My mother's second husband. My stepfather for only a handful of years, until their marriage dissolved when I was in college. He wasn't a cruel man. Just rigid. Reserved. Always precise. He used to call me kiddo in that dry, amused way of his, always keeping a careful emotional distance. Now, that voice invited me in for a session, his tone neutral as ever. He said he remembered me, that he'd be glad to help. I didn't tell my husband who it was. I told him I found someone nearby. That was enough. He nodded without looking up from his laptop. The massage studio was small, part of a converted house on the edge of town. The moment I stepped inside, a strange calm fell over me. It smelled of lavender and wood polish. There were no certificates on the wall, no soft new age music. Just a clean space, warm lighting, and him. He had aged, of course. His hair was fully gray now, cut short. His frame was still broad, disciplined. His eyes were exactly the same. Sharp. Quiet. Analytical. We didn't talk much at first. I explained the pain, he asked brief, efficient questions. When I lay on the table, face down, I felt more exposed than I expected. His hands were steady, professional. But somewhere between my shoulders and lower spine, something shifted. He paused. Just briefly. And I felt it, something unspoken. Not inappropriate, not even deliberate. Just aware. Afterward, I thanked him and made my way to the door. My legs were unsteady. My thoughts even more so. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside my husband, who fell asleep quickly as always, and stared at the ceiling. I kept thinking about how his hands had moved. About the way he had studied my face when I walked in. About how he said, "You carry tension like armor." I booked another appointment the next morning. At dinner, I told my husband it helped. He seemed relieved. "Good," he said. Then he asked about my day, and I told him about errands I hadn't run. About people I hadn't seen. I lied smoothly. Easily. And that scared me. It wasn't because I had done anything wrong. Not yet. But something inside me had cracked open. Not out of lust, not even longing. Something deeper. Like a piece of my identity had been lying dormant for years and was now waking up, stretching, asking to be acknowledged. The second appointment was 2 days later. I didn't tell anyone. I wore softer fabric this time. I did my hair. I tried not to notice that I had. He greeted me the same way, formal, direct, but this time there was a beat of silence between his words. Like we both knew the air had changed. "I adjusted the table height for you," he said. "Thank you," I replied, my voice too light. I lay down, and again his hands went to work. Professional. Controlled. But I couldn't stop focusing on the pauses. The stillness before certain strokes. The moment he placed his palm over my spine and left it there. Not pressing. Just connecting. I told myself it was in my head. That pain can make you desperate for comfort. That nostalgia plays tricks. But when I sat up afterward, clutching the towel to my chest, I saw it in his face too. Recognition. Not of me as I am now. But of some shared history. Some mutual curiosity that had survived the years. "I hope it helped," he said. "It did," I replied. But what I meant was, something else happened. Something I don't fully understand yet. I stepped outside and got into my car, gripping the steering wheel tighter than I needed to. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't look tired. I looked awake. The second appointment lingered in my mind for days. Not just because of how his hands moved, or how he had looked at me when I left. It was something deeper, something unsettling in the way my body had reacted, not with discomfort, but with longing. I wasn't used to longing. Not in that way. Not for years. I tried to push it aside. I folded laundry, answered emails, ran errands, smiled politely at the cashier who always complimented my earrings. I watched a documentary with my husband about mountain goats, nodded along, made comments when he did. But I wasn't really there. My thoughts kept circling back to the table, the silence, the way my skin had felt unusually sensitive under his hands. By the third day, I gave in and booked another appointment. I told myself it was for my back. That I couldn't afford to regress after making progress. I told myself all the right things. But when I looked in the mirror before leaving, I caught myself adjusting my blouse, smoothing my hair with more care than usual. That tiny moment of vanity felt like a betrayal, and yet, I didn't stop. The drive to the studio felt different this time. Less anxious. More deliberate. I parked in the same spot, checked my reflection, and walked in. He greeted me with a small nod, not quite a smile, but something close. The room was exactly as before. Neat. Warm. Familiar. I changed behind the screen, folded my clothes precisely, even though no one would see. When I lay down, the table felt welcoming, like a place I had returned to rather than visited. His hands moved with the same precision, but this time I noticed the rhythm. It wasn't mechanical. It was intentional. My eyes were closed, but I could tell when he hesitated, when he adjusted his pressure just slightly, when his fingers slowed near my waist. There was a moment, about halfway through, when he placed one hand flat between my shoulder blades and didn't move. He just let it rest there, grounding me. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe too loudly. And yet, in that stillness, I felt more seen than I had in months. After the session, I sat up slowly. He handed me water, his fingers brushing mine briefly. That touch sent something electric through me, not arousal, not exactly. Awareness. Like we were both walking a tightrope neither of us had acknowledged aloud. As I was about to leave, he looked at me, not just with his eyes, but fully, like he was assessing whether to say something. Then he said, "You seem different today." I smiled faintly. Maybe I'm just in less pain. We both knew that wasn't entirely true. But neither of us corrected it. Back in the car, I sat for a moment before turning the ignition. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. I felt the vibration of something shifting beneath the surface of my life, something I wasn't prepared for but couldn't deny. That night, over dinner, my husband asked how the session went. I said it helped. He nodded, chewed his food slowly, and mentioned needing to fix the gutters over the weekend. I nodded back, said something about the weather. Our words felt like old furniture, useful, familiar, but worn down by time. I wondered what he would say if I told him the truth. That I had felt something today. That it wasn't just relief or gratitude, but a flicker of desire. Not for intimacy. For attention. For recognition. For being touched not out of obligation, but out of intention. The next morning, I received a text from the therapist. Just a simple reminder about my next appointment, but the sight of his name on my phone stirred something sharp in me. I stared at it for a long time before replying with a polite confirmation. Over the following days, I became more aware of myself. I noticed the way I walked, the way I stood in front of the mirror. I started wearing softer fabrics again, colors I hadn't touched in years. My husband noticed the change, how could he not, but he didn't comment. Maybe he assumed the therapy was just making me feel better physically. Or maybe he didn't want to ask questions he feared the answers to. The fourth session was different. I arrived a few minutes early and waited in the small seating area, thumbing through an old magazine I couldn't concentrate on. When he opened the door, our eyes met for a moment longer than usual. Inside the room, I hesitated before undressing. I wondered if I should cancel. Go home. Pretend like I hadn't crossed some invisible threshold in my mind. But I didn't. I folded my clothes neatly again, lay on the table, and waited. His hands were steady as ever. But this time, I felt something new in him too. A softness. Not romantic, not possessive. Just attentive. As if he was no longer treating just the muscles, but something beneath them. Near the end, he paused. "You're holding tension in places you weren't before," he said. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "Maybe I'm afraid of what happens when it's gone." He didn't reply. But he didn't need to. That silence was heavier than words. As I dressed afterward, I caught a glimpse of myself in the small mirror in the corner. My face looked flushed, my eyes brighter. I barely recognized myself, but not in a bad way. When I stepped outside, the sun had already begun to set. The light cast long shadows across the parking lot. I stood there for a moment, not ready to go home, not ready to explain the change I felt. On the drive back, I thought about how this all began, with pain. And how now, pain felt like the smallest part of what was happening. Something else was unraveling. Something deeper. At dinner, my husband asked if I wanted to go away for the weekend. Just the two of us. I looked up, surprised. Just a little trip, he said. You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe a change of scenery would help. I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. My heart beat faster, not from excitement, but from fear. Fear that he was noticing. That he was trying. That maybe, just maybe, he sensed what I was trying not to admit even to myself. That night, I lay awake again. But this time, the ache in my back was gone. Replaced by something harder to name. Something closer to guilt. Or temptation. Or both. I spent the rest of that week pretending to be someone who wasn't unraveling. I kept the house tidy, made my husband's coffee just the way he liked it, answered emails with polite efficiency, and scheduled things in my planner with neat handwriting. From the outside, I was composed. Reliable. Predictable. But something inside me had shifted. Not in an explosive, dramatic way. More like a slow, irreversible crack in a wall that had been supporting my life for years. I kept glancing at that fracture, wondering when it would widen, wondering if it already had. We didn't end up going on that weekend trip. My husband canceled it on Friday, claiming last-minute work obligations. I nodded, feigned understanding, and didn't press. A part of me felt relief. Another part felt strangely disappointed. I couldn't tell which was worse. That Saturday morning, I walked around the neighborhood aimlessly, more to clear my thoughts than for exercise. The air had a crispness to it, the first real sign that summer was beginning to pull back. I passed houses with trimmed hedges, neat porches, and the faint sound of cartoons through open windows. Everything looked perfectly intact. But I knew better. I knew how many lives could look like this and still contain a secret chamber no one dared to enter. By the time I returned home, my back had started to ache again, not as sharply as before, but just enough to remind me of its presence. I stood in front of the mirror in our bedroom and rotated my shoulder slowly, as if looking for permission in my own reflection. Then I picked up my phone and messaged him. I didn't ask for an appointment. I just asked if he had time to talk. He responded minutes later, "I'll be at the studio until 5. I arrived that afternoon, not knowing exactly what I was walking into. The parking lot was empty. The sign on the door was flipped to closed, but I knocked anyway. He opened it himself, not wearing his usual work polo but a simple gray long-sleeve shirt. His hair was still damp, as if he had just showered. The smell of eucalyptus was lighter today, blending with something warmer, cedarwood, maybe. He didn't ask why I was there. He simply stepped aside, and I walked in. We sat opposite each other in the small waiting room. I crossed my legs, then uncrossed them. The silence was comfortable but charged. It was the kind of silence that holds a dozen unspoken sentences between two people who aren't sure who should speak first. I finally said I wasn't sure what I needed. That I didn't know if this was about pain, or history, or loneliness, or maybe all of it. He listened without interruption, eyes steady, hands folded on his knee. When I stopped speaking, he simply nodded. "You don't have to explain it," he said. "Not to me." That single sentence sat with me longer than anything else. It wasn't a dismissal. It was recognition. Of all the unsaid things I carried, things I'd been trying to silence for years with politeness and efficiency. Eventually, he stood and offered a session. I accepted without a word. The massage this time was different. Less clinical, though still professional. He adjusted the table height again, dimmed the lights just slightly more than usual, and let the silence stretch between us like fabric. When his hands moved, I noticed the changes. Softer pressure at the base of my spine. Longer pauses near my shoulders. A kind of attentiveness that was more than muscle work. He was reading my body in a language I didn't even know I spoke. I didn't talk. I couldn't. Every time I opened my mouth, I felt emotion press against my chest like a wave I wasn't ready to release. Near the end of the session, he rested one hand gently on the center of my back. Not moving. Not kneading. Just holding. I felt tears sting my eyes for no reason I could name. When it was over, I sat up slowly. My breath came in shallow waves, like I had just surfaced from underwater. He handed me a bottle of water and waited by the door, giving me space. I changed back into my clothes, folded the towel neatly, and looked once more into the mirror. The woman looking back at me still resembled the one from before, but her eyes held something else now. Something awake. As I left, I thanked him. He said, "You know where to find me." I drove around for a long time before going home. I passed a bookstore I used to love but hadn't visited in years. I parked in front of it without even thinking and went inside. The scent of paper and dust was oddly comforting. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers along spines, remembering what it felt like to get lost in someone else's story. I didn't buy anything. I didn't need to. It wasn't about the books. It was about claiming space. Being alone with my thoughts, without anyone asking what was for dinner or if I had remembered to pay the water bill. When I finally returned home, the house was dark. My husband had left a note on the kitchen counter. Went out with Tom. Back late. No kiss. No smiley face. Just ink and silence. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, watching the ice slowly melt. I wondered if he suspected anything. If he was choosing not to ask. If he had built his own quiet wall, just like mine, and preferred to keep it intact. Part of me wanted him to ask. Not so I could confess, but so he would notice. So he would care. But he didn't. And maybe that hurt more than anything else. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again. My back didn't hurt. But everything else did. Not in a physical way, but in that vague, shapeless ache that settles when something vital is missing and you can't quite remember when it left. I closed my eyes, trying to summon guilt. But instead, I felt clarity. A sense that whatever happened next wouldn't be impulsive. It would be a choice. And I wasn't sure whose hands I trusted more anymore, his or my own. The next few days passed in a blur of habits. I folded laundry that was already clean, wiped counters that weren't dirty, and organized drawers that no one ever opened. It felt easier to do things with my hands than to sit still. Stillness meant thinking, and thinking meant acknowledging that something irreversible had already happened. I avoided booking another session right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to test myself. To see if I was strong enough to return to normal. To see if this shift inside me, was just a moment of weakness or something more enduring. My husband, ever practical, filled the silence in our home with lists. Light bulbs that needed replacing. Bills that needed reviewing. Dinners that needed planning. His voice, calm and deliberate, slid over me like wallpaper, present but barely noticed. I listened. I nodded. I responded in half smiles and one-word answers. He didn't notice the difference. Or if he did, he didn't show it. One evening, as I was placing clean towels in the linen closet, I paused and pressed my hand against the wall. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I needed to feel something solid. Something unmoving. The truth was, my mind kept drifting back to that quiet room, to the sound of his footsteps across the hardwood floor, to the stillness of his hand resting between my shoulder blades. I told myself I was romanticizing it, exaggerating its importance. But another part of me knew better. It wasn't about the man. It was about being reminded that I was still a woman. That beneath all the years of being a wife, a caretaker, a responsible adult, there was still a part of me that needed more. On Wednesday morning, I stood in front of my closet and stared at a row of identical neutral blouses. For years, I'd chosen clothes based on practicality and modesty. But that day, my fingers paused on a silk shirt I hadn't worn in over a decade. Soft, deep blue, with just a hint of sheen. I didn't try to justify it. I just put it on. The mirror's reflection surprised me. I looked less like the version of myself I had grown used to, and more like someone I used to be, someone who took care in her appearance not for attention, but for ownership. I booked another appointment. This time, I didn't overthink it. I simply called, confirmed the time, and added it to my calendar like any other task. When I arrived, he was already waiting in the doorway, as if he had sensed I wouldn't cancel again. He didn't comment on how I looked, but I noticed the brief pause in his expression. A flicker of recognition. Or maybe restraint. We exchanged minimal words. The familiarity between us had grown dense, like a fabric stretched tight. It didn't need more weight. It needed care. Inside the room, I lay down, face to the side, my hands tucked gently under the towel. His movements were slower this time, deliberate, almost reverent. I wondered if he, too, had spent the past few days wrestling with a quiet storm. As he worked through the muscles in my back, I felt a tension I hadn't known I was carrying begin to shift. Not just physical, but emotional, layers of resignation and denial unraveling one by one. He paused near my shoulder, his thumb pressing lightly into a knot that had formed since our last session. I closed my eyes tighter. Not from pain, but from something harder to explain, a vulnerability I hadn't prepared for. I thought about what I would say if he asked me why I kept coming back. The answer would be complicated. It wouldn't be about the relief in my spine or the improvement in my posture. It would be about that moment of stillness, that quiet presence, that sense that for 50 minutes, someone was fully attuned to me. Not out of duty, not out of habit, but out of intention. When the session ended, he stepped back and gave me space to sit up. I did so slowly, feeling a strange calm settle over me. He handed me water, and I accepted it without a word. As I dressed behind the partition, I ran my fingers along the fabric of my silk shirt. I realized how different I felt in it, how it reminded me of softness, of movement, of self. Before leaving, I lingered by the door. He was tidying the table, adjusting the blanket with methodical care. I turned and said, "Thank you." He looked up. "You're welcome." The simplicity of the exchange carried more weight than any long conversation could have. That evening, I returned home to find my husband in the garage, sorting through old boxes. He greeted me with a brief smile, then asked if I remembered where we stored the power drill. I answered, walked into the house, and stood in the kitchen for several minutes, unsure what to do next. I poured myself a glass of wine, something I rarely did on weeknights, and sat by the window. Outside, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the lawn. I watched as the light slowly shifted, bathing everything in a soft amber glow. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine a life where I didn't have to choose between obligation and feeling. Where there was space for both. I knew that moment wouldn't last. I knew the time would come when choices would have to be made. But for now, I let myself sit in the in-between. Later that night, as we lay in bed, my husband reached for my hand. It was rare for him to initiate any form of intimacy lately. His fingers were warm, steady. I held his hand back. Not out of guilt and not out of longing. But because, for the first time in a long time, I realized that connection, real connection, was more than just proximity. It was presence. And I was still learning how to show up. The days following that last session felt suspended in a kind of quiet limbo. I moved through them with a strange calmness, as though I were standing in a slow-moving stream, water gently pulling at my ankles, but not yet strong enough to sweep me off my feet. I knew I had reached some inner threshold, but I hadn't crossed it yet. My back pain was virtually gone now. At least, the physical part. That dull throb that used to wake me up at night had faded to nothing more than a distant echo. But what had replaced it was far less definable. A stirring. A tension beneath the skin. Not pain, not pleasure, just pressure. A quiet but persistent reminder that my life was no longer balanced the way it once was. That Friday, my husband suggested we go out to dinner. The proposal caught me off guard, not because it was unusual, but because of how casually he said it. As if he had read it off a checklist. I agreed, and we went to one of the usual places, a dimly lit restaurant with booths lined in maroon leather, where the menu hadn't changed in years. We sat across from each other, sipping wine we didn't really like, eating food we barely tasted. The conversation was light, impersonal. Work updates. Errands. Neighborhood gossip. I nodded and smiled in all the right places. He did too. At one point, he reached for my hand across the table. I let him take it. His grip was familiar, secure, but the electricity wasn't there. Not absent out of disdain, just dulled by time and repetition. When we got home, he lingered in the kitchen while I went upstairs. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, wiping away my makeup in slow, deliberate strokes. I looked into my own eyes, trying to recognize the person behind them. She looked calm. Measured. But something inside her pulsed with contradiction. The next morning, I found myself pacing. There was nothing urgent on my calendar. I had already canceled my standing coffee with a friend from book club. I couldn't focus on reading, and even laundry felt like a performance. Eventually, I sat down and opened my phone. My fingers hovered over the messaging app longer than necessary. I told myself I wouldn't reach out again. But the truth was, that boundary had dissolved quietly days ago. I typed without rereading. Do you have a session open this afternoon? He responded, 3 o'clock is free. It wasn't impulsive. It felt inevitable. When I arrived, he was standing outside the building, sipping from a thermos. He looked at me as I pulled into the lot, but didn't smile. Just nodded. That was enough. Inside, the air felt warmer than usual. Or maybe it was just me. The same neutral tones filled the space. The same folded towels, the same essential oil diffuser humming quietly in the corner. Everything familiar. Everything steady. I undressed with practiced efficiency, folding my clothes carefully and placing them on the small bench. As I lay on the table, face down, I closed my eyes and focused on my breath. Slow. Deep. Controlled. He entered the room softly. His steps had a rhythm I recognized now, like a song without lyrics. His touch, when it came, was light at first. Exploring. Checking. Then firmer, grounding. We didn't speak. We hadn't needed words for some time. The tension in my shoulders released first, then in my lower back. But underneath that release was a rising intensity, an awareness between us that hummed louder with every passing moment. Not sexual. Not overt. Just presence. The fullness of two people occupying the same moment without distraction or artifice. Halfway through the session, I felt his hands pause. Not in hesitation, but in transition. He adjusted his stance, shifted pressure, and moved closer to where the ache had lived for so long. His thumb pressed gently into the hollow of my hip, and suddenly everything stopped. Time. Thought. Movement. And in that stillness, without planning it, we kissed. We kissed. No more. No less. No dramatic confession. No explosion of feeling. Just a quiet, suspended truth that neither of us could ignore any longer. When it ended, we didn't speak. I didn't look at him. I just lay there, trying to understand what had just changed, because something had, and it was permanent. After a few minutes, he stepped back, allowing me the space to sit up, to gather myself. I moved slowly, careful not to rush, not to break the quiet around us. I dressed in silence, tying the buttons of my blouse with steady fingers. When I stepped back into the hallway, he was standing near the shelf, refolding a towel that didn't need refolding. I looked at him, and he looked back. Not searching, not questioning. Just meeting me where I was. I said goodbye. He nodded again. That was all. Outside, the late afternoon sun was low, casting soft golden light over everything. The world looked the same. But I wasn't. Driving home, I replayed the moment again and again in my mind. Not the kiss itself, but the decision. The silence before it. The breath we both held. The way it felt like crossing a line I had been tiptoeing along for weeks. At home, the house was quiet. My husband's keys were on the counter, his shoes by the door. He was upstairs, likely working or napping. I set down my purse, walked to the sink, and splashed cold water on my face. In the mirror, I didn't look guilty. I didn't even look relieved. I looked awake. That evening, we had dinner together. Pasta and salad. A glass of wine. A movie on in the background. At one point, he asked me how my day was. I told him it was fine. That I had run errands and done some writing. He nodded and didn't ask for details. Later, as we got ready for bed, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and watched him for a moment. He was brushing his teeth, his eyes focused on the mirror. I wondered what he saw when he looked at himself. If he saw the same man I did. If he sensed, on some level, that something had shifted between us. He turned off the light and climbed into bed. I joined him a minute later. We lay side by side, not touching, not speaking. Just breathing in the same dark. And in that darkness, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. That the distance between us hadn't been caused by a single moment. It had been built slowly. Over years. And now, with one kiss, a different kind of distance had begun. One I could no longer deny. The morning after the kiss, everything around me seemed sharper, colors more saturated, sounds more defined. Even the ordinary act of pouring coffee felt weighted, like it had consequences. I moved through the kitchen with deliberate slowness, as if hurrying might draw attention to what I was hiding. But the truth was, I wasn't even sure what I was hiding yet. My husband sat across from me, scrolling through his tablet as he sipped his coffee. The same routine. The same silence. The same predictable rhythm that had once comforted me and now felt like a kind of sleepwalking. I studied his face, wondering how many mornings we had shared like this, and how many of them I had truly been present for. I wondered, too, if he noticed the difference in me. If the subtle changes, my posture, the way I brushed my hair, the way I looked at him when I spoke, registered somewhere deep inside, even if he never said it aloud. He told me he had a client meeting out of town that afternoon and would be back late. I nodded, swallowing the immediate spark of emotion that surfaced at the thought of being alone in the house. Relief, guilt, anticipation, they came tangled together. After he left, I stood at the window for a long time, watching his car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. I didn't move until the rumble of the engine faded completely. Only then did I sit down, my hands clasped together tightly in my lap. I hadn't planned anything. There had been no discussion, no invitation. But my body had already made the decision hours ago. By noon, I had showered and changed into something simple: the jeans, a light sweater, my hair left down. I looked at myself in the mirror and wondered if I was making a mistake. But the question felt too late. I was already holding the keys. Already walking toward the door. The drive was familiar, but it felt different this time. I turned off the radio and drove in silence, the hum of the tires on the pavement the only sound accompanying my thoughts. When I arrived at the studio, it was closed. That didn't surprise me. I hadn't made an appointment. Still, I parked and sat in the car, hands resting on the steering wheel. I stared at the door for several minutes before stepping out. I didn't knock. I sent a short message: "I'm outside. Only if it's okay." A few minutes passed. Then the door opened. He stood there, not saying anything. Just looking at me. I took a breath and stepped forward. We didn't speak much. He gestured for me to come in, and I followed him into the quiet, dim space I had come to know so well. He didn't ask what I needed. He didn't need to. There was no session that day. No massage. No formality. We sat across from each other in the waiting room, not even pretending we had another purpose. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. Eventually, he said that maybe we needed space. That what had happened wasn't part of any plan, and that crossing that line, even once, complicated everything. I agreed. I said I understood. I said I wasn't asking for anything more. We sat there a little longer, neither of us moving. Then he stood, walked me to the door, and said goodbye. It felt final. But not cruel. I drove home slowly, letting each red light stretch out, giving myself time to settle into the decision we had just made without naming it as such. When I arrived home, the house was still empty. I walked through the rooms as if I were visiting someone else's life. The pictures on the walls, the familiar arrangement of furniture, the scent of lemon from the freshly cleaned counters, it all belonged to a version of myself I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the pattern on the comforter. My hands rested in my lap again, just as they had that morning, but now they felt heavier. When my husband returned that evening, he looked tired. He loosened his tie, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day had gone. I said it was quiet. He poured himself a drink, and we sat on the couch in silence, watching the news. I wanted to ask him something, anything, that might reopen a door between us. But I didn't know which door to choose. That night, in bed, he reached for me. Not with urgency, not with passion, but with familiarity. I responded the way I always had, softly, compliantly, but something in me stayed separate. Afterwards, I lay awake, listening to his breathing grow steady. I stared at the ceiling, retracing every moment of the day, trying to make sense of how something could feel both like an ending and a beginning. The next morning, I woke early. I went for a walk through the neighborhood, the air cool and damp with early dew. The world was quiet, barely stirring. As I walked, I thought about the choices I had made, not just the ones from the past few weeks, but the ones that had built my life year by year. The ways I had settled. The ways I had allowed silence to replace conversation. When I returned home, I made a list. Not of chores or errands, but of feelings. Words that had been echoing inside me with no place to land. Disconnection. Resentment. Yearning. Clarity. And at the bottom, I wrote one more word. Possibility. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know what I wanted to happen. But I knew that something inside me had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. And for the first time in a long time, I was okay with not knowing. The invitation came unexpectedly, but it wasn't unwelcome. My husband suggested we take a weekend away, just the two of us. He said we hadn't done something like that in years, and he was right. I had been the one to quietly let go of those kinds of trips, retreating into my routines, telling myself we were too busy, too tired, too set in our ways. When he brought it up over dinner, I nodded slowly, unsure of his reasons but too weary to ask. There was a tightness in my chest, not from excitement but from uncertainty. What did he hope this trip would fix? Or worse, did he feel something slipping away and want to reclaim it before it was too late? We drove out of town early Saturday morning. The sky was pale and colorless, the kind of sky that doesn't commit to rain or sun. As the car moved along the highway, I stared out the window, watching the blur of trees and gas stations, wondering how many couples made this same quiet journey, carrying things unsaid between them like luggage. The place he chose was simple, a small bed and breakfast near the lake, with white wooden siding and flower boxes in the windows. The kind of place designed for calm. The kind of place meant for reconnection. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lavender and pine. We were shown to our room, a modest space with a quilted bedspread, a small fireplace, and a pair of armchairs facing a window that overlooked the water. My husband thanked the innkeeper, set down his bag, and stretched his arms with a contented sigh. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded in my lap. The rest of the afternoon passed slowly. We walked along the lake, our conversation light and practical, weather, books, a few stories from work. At times, we fell into silence, and I didn't mind. Other times, I could feel the weight of his gaze lingering on me, as though he was trying to see something that wasn't quite visible anymore. That night, after dinner at a nearby restaurant, we returned to the room and sat by the fireplace. The air between us was warmer than it had been in months. We shared a bottle of wine, and he asked me to put on some music from my phone. I chose something soft and familiar. He reached for my hand, and I let him. He leaned closer, and I didn't move away. We spent the night together. The details don't matter, not here, not now. What mattered was the quiet afterward. The stillness. The way I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, listening to the sound of his breathing, and wondering if this was repair or retreat. In the morning, he looked at me differently. Not in suspicion, not in gratitude, just with curiosity. As if he were unsure of what version of me had woken up beside him. We ate breakfast in the dining room downstairs, homemade scones, fruit, and coffee served in delicate porcelain cups. He chatted with the other guests, made polite jokes, told the story of how we'd met. I smiled along, feeling like a character being played well. On the drive home, the sun finally came out. It spilled through the windshield, casting light across his hands on the steering wheel. I watched the trees pass again, but this time I didn't feel the same stillness. Inside, I was restless. My body remembered something my mind was trying to suppress. A touch that hadn't been meant to reignite a marriage, but to awaken a self. Back at home, we unpacked in silence. He offered to start a load of laundry while I tidied the kitchen. Everything about our rhythm felt smoother, like the trip had loosened the knots in our interactions. But inside, I knew the real tension hadn't dissolved. It had only shifted, moved into another room. That night, as I lay in bed, I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. I hadn't expected any. But the emptiness of the screen still made my chest tighten. I wanted to believe I had made a choice, that returning to my husband, accepting his hand, letting him pull me back into our shared life, was a decision born of love, not fear. But the truth was, I wasn't sure. The next morning, I stood at the window again, coffee in hand, staring at the street. Everything looked unchanged. The same neighbors leaving at the same time. The same garbage truck turning the corner. I thought about calling. About sending one message. Just to ask how he was. To say thank you. To say nothing at all, but still be heard. I didn't. Instead, I opened my planner, crossed out the appointment I hadn't made yet, and wrote a word in its place. Stillness. Not as a goal, but as a reminder. Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't choosing between two people. It's choosing between the version of yourself that stayed silent for years and the one who finally learned how to listen. And in that moment, I knew the silence between us wasn't empty. It was waiting. The following week returned with the kind of normalcy that should have brought relief but only stirred a deeper unrest. I woke early, dressed methodically, and moved through the motions of daily life with practiced ease. My husband went to work, as usual, and I stayed behind to tend to the house, answer emails, and make a list of groceries I didn't really need. The house felt too quiet, though not because anything had changed. It was the same silence we had lived in for years, the kind that hums beneath the surface, unspoken and uninterrupted. But now, I could hear it. I noticed the sound of the refrigerator cycling, the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards, the way the walls seemed to breathe when the windows were closed. I tried to distract myself with small tasks. I dusted the shelves in the guest room. I refolded the linens in the hallway closet. I even sat at the piano for a while, playing through half a song before stopping mid-sentence, unsure why I had started in the first place. Around midday, I made myself lunch and ate it standing at the counter. The kitchen light caught on the edge of my plate, and for a brief second, I imagined what my life might look like from the outside. A woman with time on her hands. A clean kitchen. A stable marriage. A life that, by most accounts, should be enough. I rinsed the dish and left it in the drying rack. I didn't bother wiping the counter. That evening, my husband returned home later than usual. He explained something about traffic and meetings, then kissed me on the cheek as he passed. I nodded, asked if he wanted dinner, and he said he'd just eat leftovers. We ate separately. He in front of the television. I at the table. I listened to the voices from the living room drift through the hallway. News anchors discussing the economy. Commercials for medications and car insurance. Laughter from a sitcom I hadn't watched in years. Afterward, I wandered into the garage and stood there for no reason at all. The smell of old cardboard and motor oil clung to the air. I stared at the boxes stacked along the wall, remnants of old hobbies, and used tools, things we had promised to sort through but never did. In the corner sat a small folding chair, the kind we used to take to soccer games when our son was still in school. I sat down in it, arms crossed, and let the silence wrap around me like a heavy coat. I stayed there for nearly an hour before returning inside. He was already upstairs. The lights were dimmed. I climbed into bed beside him, our bodies separated by habit, not conflict. I stared at the ceiling, eyes open, thoughts loud. I thought about the studio, about the quiet space I had grown to crave. I wondered if he thought of me at all. I wondered if the stillness we had agreed upon was truly still for him, too. The next morning, I found myself checking my phone more than usual. No new messages. No calls. I placed it down, then picked it up again. A ridiculous pattern. A need for something unspoken to be answered. I went for a walk just before noon. The weather was neither warm nor cold, and the wind carried the smell of cut grass and distant rain. I passed the homes of neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months. Some of their windows were open. I heard music, laughter, the soft clatter of dishes. Halfway through my walk, I passed a bench at the edge of a park and sat down. I watched as a young couple chased their toddler across the grass. The mother laughed, her hand outstretched, while the father followed close behind, pretending to be out of breath. They looked joyful. Or at least, they looked present. I watched them longer than I meant to. I wasn't envious of their youth. I was envious of their engagement, the way they poured their attention into a single moment, into each other. When I returned home, my husband was on a call. I overheard him pacing the hallway upstairs, his voice professional, composed. I didn't interrupt. I didn't want to. That night, I dreamed I was in a room full of closed doors. Some were plain, others painted in colors I didn't recognize. I walked among them, unsure which one to open, or if I was meant to open any at all. When I finally placed my hand on a doorknob, the dream faded. The next morning, I woke with a lingering sense of indecision. I moved through the motions again, coffee, dishes, laundry, but everything felt farther away, like I was watching myself from another room. At some point in the afternoon, I found myself standing by the car, keys in hand, unsure how I had gotten there. I didn't start the engine. I just sat in the driver's seat, staring ahead, fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel. I thought about driving. I didn't have a destination. I just wanted motion. I wanted to feel the road beneath me. To believe that something, anything, was changing. But I didn't drive. I got out of the car and walked back inside. The day ended the way most days did. Dinner. Quiet. Separate routines. He read in bed while I scrolled through news articles I didn't care about. Before turning out the light, he said, "You've been quiet lately." I said, "I guess I've just been thinking a lot." He nodded, adjusted his pillow, and said goodnight. The room fell silent again. And I laid there, eyes open, wondering how long you can lie next to someone and still feel alone. Wondering, too, if he felt it. If he ever reached for me in the dark and found the space where I used to be. The weather turned midweek. Heavy clouds rolled in and hovered above the neighborhood like a lid sealing everything shut. The air became damp, pressing against the windows and dulling the edges of every sound. I stayed indoors for most of it, sipping lukewarm tea and watching the sky from the living room, as though expecting it to reveal something. I wasn't avoiding anything specific, but I was also not moving toward anything. I lived in a strange middle space now, suspended between the choices I'd made and the ones I hadn't yet. It was a quiet kind of paralysis, the kind that seeps in when every direction feels weighted. On Thursday, I found myself rearranging the books on the hallway shelf. I didn't have a plan. I just needed something to do with my hands. I moved novels I hadn't touched in years, their dust jackets worn, spines slightly faded. Some of them had inscriptions from old friends, notes I'd forgotten. I paused over a collection of essays I'd once underlined so thoroughly it looked like every sentence had tried to speak to me. I sat down with the book in my lap and opened it to a random page. The passage read, "Sometimes, the courage we need most is not to leave, but to stay, and stay awake." I closed the book gently, not sure whether I agreed. Later that day, while sorting through a drawer in the kitchen, I found a postcard from a vacation we'd taken almost 10 years ago. The photo was of a lighthouse, silhouetted against a clear sky. On the back, in my husband's handwriting, was a brief note, "Still my favorite view." I stared at the words for a long time. They felt distant, like a memory that didn't belong to me anymore. Not because it wasn't real, but because something had eroded around it. That evening, I cooked dinner without much thought. Chopped vegetables, sautéed chicken, a light sauce. My husband arrived home just before 7, smelling faintly of the outside air. He said something about traffic. I nodded. We ate together. We asked each other about our days. We answered. There was no sharpness in our voices, no tension. Just routine. Smooth and undisturbed. After dinner, he took a call in the other room. I cleaned the dishes slowly, my hands submerged in hot water. I didn't rush. I wasn't in a hurry to return to the couch, to the background noise of television, to the space we occupied side by side, growing quieter with each passing night. When he came back, he sat beside me with a folder in his hands, paperwork from the office, charts and notes. I glanced over, feigned interest, and returned to the article I had pulled up on my tablet. We said goodnight like we always did. A small kiss, a shared sleep well, and two bodies turning inward towards sleep and away from each other. That night, I dreamed again. Not of closed doors this time, but of mirrors. In each one, I saw a different version of myself, some older, some younger, some with eyes that looked straight ahead and others who turned away. I stood between them, unsure of which one I belonged to. When I woke, the dream stayed with me like a whisper. I carried it into the morning, through the making of coffee, the folding of laundry, the emails answered without attention. By mid-morning, I had opened my phone and scrolled through old messages. Not looking for anything. Just confirming what wasn't there. I thought of calling someone, an old friend, a sister, anyone, but couldn't bring myself to fill the silence with the sound of my own uncertainty. Instead, I opened a blank document on my laptop and began to write. Not a letter. Not a confession. Just words. I wrote about standing in my kitchen with wet hands and wondering who I had become. I wrote about the silence that had settled between us like a third person in the room. I wrote about the memory of touch and the ache of restraint. I didn't save it. I didn't delete it. I just left it open, as if it needed to breathe. By the time my husband came home that evening, I had prepared dinner again. Something simple, but warm. He noticed. He thanked me. We ate in the dining room this time. No television. Just silverware, the sound of glasses on the table, and the occasional mention of headlines we both half understood. Afterward, I returned to the hallway bookshelf and pulled down one of the photo albums. I flipped through the pages slowly, tracing the edges of our younger selves with my fingertips. Smiling faces. Beach days. Dimly lit dinners. And then I found a photo I hadn't seen in years, one from the early years of our marriage. I was laughing, head thrown back, sunlight caught in my hair. He was looking at me, not at the camera. His expression was soft, full. I stared at that photo for a long time. It felt both comforting and painful. A glimpse into something that had existed and could no longer be returned to, not because it had been destroyed, but because it had changed. I placed the album back on the shelf and sat down on the floor beside it. I didn't cry. I didn't feel like crying. I felt ready. Not for confrontation. Not for decisions. But ready to admit that the life I had built had become too quiet. That something had closed inside me long ago, and now it was finally asking to be opened. And I didn't know what that would look like. But I knew I couldn't pretend not to hear it anymore. The morning began like all the others, with the sound of the heat clicking on in the vents and the faint light of early sun stretching across the floorboards. I stood by the kitchen sink, cradling a warm mug in my palms, and watched the condensation on the window blur the view of the yard. The stillness was familiar by now, not unwelcome, but heavy in its own quiet way. There was no particular plan for the day. The laundry was already folded. The fridge was full. My inbox had been cleared the night before. It was the kind of day that should have felt productive or peaceful. Instead, it felt like waiting. After breakfast, I found myself drifting between rooms without purpose. I picked up a book, read the same paragraph 3 times, then set it down again. I opened the window just slightly to let in the cool air, then closed it. I changed my earrings. I changed them back. By late morning, I stood in front of my closet and reached for the sweater I hadn't worn in years. It was soft and simple, a pale shade of gray that matched the sky outside. I didn't know why I chose it. Maybe I wanted to feel like someone who could still choose things for herself. The hours passed slowly. My husband was at work, as usual. I didn't expect any messages or calls. I didn't want any. I just needed the space, and for once, I had it. At one point, I sat at the piano again. I played a few chords, let them echo through the house. The sound filled the empty rooms with something that wasn't joy or sorrow, just presence. I didn't stay long. I didn't finish the song. I spent the early afternoon organizing the drawers in the hallway, items we never used, half-empty candles, chargers with no devices, mismatched batteries. I sorted them into small piles, some for keeping, some for tossing. It felt good to decide something, even if it was just the fate of forgotten objects. At 3 o'clock, I poured myself another cup of tea and sat by the front window. I watched the wind rustle through the leaves, saw a neighbor walk his dog, waved absent-mindedly when he looked up. The sky remained gray but didn't threaten rain. It was quiet. Deeply, unmistakably quiet. Not just in the house but inside me. And in that silence, something settled. For weeks, I had been moving through layers of guilt, memory, restraint, longing. I had been trying to name what I wanted without saying it aloud. I had been holding two versions of myself in tension, waiting for one to outlast the other. But now, I wasn't waiting anymore. That evening, when my husband came home, I met him at the door. He looked surprised, but not startled. He smiled the way he always did, kind, reliable, unreadable. I stepped aside, let him in, watched as he set down his briefcase and loosened his collar. Dinner was already in the oven. I had made something familiar, something he liked. The scent filled the house in a comforting way. We sat at the table, and for a while, we talked. About his day, about the headlines, about whether the roof needed checking before winter. I responded where I could. I asked questions when they were needed. It was easy, in the way that long relationships become. After we ate, we washed dishes together. The warm water steamed gently in the sink, and for a moment, our hands brushed while passing a plate. He smiled again. I did, too. But even in the warmth of the water, even in the simplicity of the routine, I knew something was ending. That night, after he had gone to bed, I stayed up. I sat on the edge of the couch and stared at the blank television screen. The room was dark except for a small lamp in the corner, casting a soft circle of light. I picked up my journal, the one I hadn't touched in weeks, and flipped through the empty pages. Then I began to write. I wrote about a version of myself that had grown quiet and careful. I wrote about the ache that started in my back and turned into something much deeper. I wrote about the choice I had made and the space it had opened inside me. And then, slowly, I wrote about endings. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that come with slammed doors or shouted words. But the quiet ones. The ones that happen in kitchens and hallways and shared silences. The ones that stretch out slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you look around and realize something essential is no longer there. I wrote about love, and how it can become habit. How affection can become politeness. How presence can become absence if you're not careful. I wrote about my husband, not as a villain or a savior, but as a person. Someone who had been steady when I needed steadiness. Who had offered me a life that was safe, even if it wasn't full. And I wrote about myself, not as a woman who betrayed, or one who was betrayed, but as someone who woke up one day and realized she had stopped feeling. And then began again. I closed the journal and set it aside. I stood, walked through the dark house, and paused in the doorway of our bedroom. He was asleep, one arm draped across the pillow, his breathing even. I watched him for a long time. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel relief. I felt clarity. The next morning, I woke early. I moved through the motions as usual to coffee, toast, a glance at the calendar. But the difference was in the knowing. In the understanding that I was no longer suspended between versions of myself. I was here. Whole. Unfinished. Awake. And whatever came next, I would walk toward it with eyes open. Because the hardest part had never been the decision itself. It had been admitting that I was allowed to choose.